I'm Alex, 25, and I thought I knew exactly how far my family would go to punish me for standing up to their golden child favoritism until the day they orchestrated my abandonment in the middle of nowhere, 3 miles from any cell signal, because I refused to hand over my car keys to my sister who had just crashed her third vehicle in 2 years. What they didn't know was that their twisted punishment would lead me to discover a family secret so devastating it would expose years of financial fraud, insurance scams, and criminal conspiracies that made their systematic favoritism look like child's play compared to the federal crimes they'd been committing. Before we dive into this shocking tale of family betrayal that'll make you question everyone you trust with your safety, I'm dying to know, what do you think my family's reaction was when they realized their stubborn daughter had evidence that could send them all to prison? Drop your wildest theories in the comments. If stories about toxic families who punish independence while rewarding reckless behavior make your blood boil, smash that like button and subscribe because this journey of survival and ultimate justice is about to reveal why some people create their own destruction. Growing up as the older daughter in the Morrison household meant watching my younger sister Casey receive unlimited second chances, financial bailouts, and parental protection from every consequence of her increasingly reckless and destructive behavior. While I was held to impossibly high standards and punished severely for minor mistakes, Casey lived in a consequence-free bubble where her failures were always someone else's fault and her problems were always the family's responsibility to solve. The pattern had been established early in our childhood, but it became genuinely dangerous as Casey entered her teens and began making choices that put herself and others at serious risk. Her first car accident at 16 had been dismissed as a learning experience despite the fact that she'd been texting while driving and rear-ended a family with young children. The insurance claim was handled quietly, her driving privileges were restored immediately, and the incident was treated as bad luck rather than evidence of poor judgment and dangerous priorities. By age 23, Casey had crashed 4 vehicles, received multiple traffic citations for reckless driving, and been arrested twice for driving under the influence. Each incident was met with immediate family intervention designed to minimize consequences rather than address the underlying patterns of destructive behavior that were escalating in both frequency and severity. The most recent accident had occurred just 3 weeks before the events that would change our family dynamic forever. Casey had been driving home from a party at 2 a.m. when she lost control of her BMW. The replacement car my parents had purchased after her previous accident, and crashed into a telephone pole. The impact had been severe enough to total the vehicle and send Casey to the emergency room with injuries that required overnight observation. Instead of treating this latest accident as a wake-up call about Casey's dangerous driving habits and ongoing substance abuse issues, my parents had immediately begun planning to purchase yet another replacement vehicle while simultaneously working with expensive attorneys to minimize the legal consequences of her DUI charges. Casey is going through a difficult phase right now, my mother explained when I expressed concern about enabling her sister's dangerous behavior. She needs family support to get through this challenging time, not judgment and criticism. We have to help her rebuild her confidence and get back on track. The difficult phase narrative had been my parents' explanation for Casey's behavior for over 7 years, during which her destructive choices had escalated from academic problems and social drama to criminal charges and accidents that could have killed innocent people. The family's response had been to increase financial support and decrease expectations rather than demand accountability and behavioral changes. Meanwhile, my own relationship with cars and driving had been subject to completely different standards and expectations from the moment I got my license. I had been required to maintain perfect driving records, pay for my own insurance and maintenance, and treat vehicle ownership as a privilege that could be revoked for any infraction or attitude problem. When I had received a single speeding ticket at age 19, for going 7 miles over the speed limit in a construction zone, my parents had confiscated my car keys for 2 weeks and required me to attend defensive driving classes at my own expense. The message had been clear: I was held to standards of perfection while Casey's criminal behavior was treated as family misfortune requiring collective support. The financial disparity in how our vehicle-related expenses were handled revealed the deepest levels of differential treatment and family resource allocation. Casey's insurance premiums, which had skyrocketed due to her accidents and citations, were paid by my parents as part of their ongoing support for her recovery from her challenging phase. Her car maintenance, repairs, and replacement costs were handled as routine family expenses that required no contribution or concern from Casey herself. My vehicle expenses, in contrast, had been my personal responsibility since the day I received my license. Insurance, gas, maintenance, repairs, and registration fees were treated as adult responsibilities that I needed to budget and manage independently, regardless of my student status or limited income from part-time work. The psychological impact of watching my parents fund Casey's destructive behavior while demanding complete financial independence for my responsible choices was devastating and created resentment that had been building for years. Every insurance payment I made for my carefully maintained vehicle was a reminder that my sister's criminal negligence was subsidized by family resources while my perfect driving record earned me no support or recognition. But what made the differential treatment particularly galling was how it was justified through victim blaming and character assassination directed at me whenever I questioned the fairness of the arrangements. When I pointed out that Casey's behavior was dangerous and that enabling her wasn't helping her develop better judgment, my parents' response was always to characterize my concerns as jealousy, selfishness, or lack of family loyalty. "Alex, your sister is struggling right now, and she needs our support," my father would say when I expressed frustration about the endless financial bailouts. "Instead of criticizing her, you should be grateful that you don't need the same level of help. Your independence is something to be proud of, not something to resent." The implication was always that my self-sufficiency was evidence of superior character that should make me happy to watch family resources flow exclusively toward Casey's crisis management. I was expected to celebrate my own financial struggles as character building while remaining silent about the unfairness of subsidizing my sister's irresponsibility. The most recent crisis had escalated beyond typical family drama when Casey's legal team informed my parents that her DUI charges could result in license suspension that would make it impossible for her to maintain employment or attend court-ordered counseling sessions. The solution my parents proposed was as predictable as it was outrageous. I should temporarily loan Casey my car while they worked on securing her another vehicle. "It's just temporary, Alex," my mother had explained during the family meeting where this proposal was presented as a reasonable request rather than an unreasonable demand. "Casey needs reliable transportation to meet her legal obligations and maintain her job. You have a perfect driving record and excellent public transportation options, so lending her your car would be the family-oriented thing to do." The suggestion that I should give up my independence and mobility to enable Casey's continued avoidance of consequences for her criminal behavior was so outrageous that I had initially assumed it was a joke. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that my parents viewed my cooperation as not just expected but mandatory for maintaining family harmony. "This isn't really a request, Alex," my father had said when I expressed reluctance to hand over my car keys. "Casey's legal situation is serious, and the family needs to work together to help her get through this. Your car is the obvious solution, and we expect you to be supportive." The implication that my property was actually family property subject to redistribution based on Casey's needs was a level of entitlement and boundary violation that revealed how little respect my parents had for my autonomy or rights as an adult family member. My refusal to voluntarily surrender my vehicle had been met with escalating pressure tactics that included emotional manipulation, financial threats, and ultimately the orchestrated abandonment that would expose the full scope of my family's criminal behavior and moral bankruptcy. The week following my initial refusal to hand over my car keys became an intensive family pressure campaign designed to wear down my resistance through emotional manipulation, financial threats, and systematic isolation from any support system that might validate my position. My parents approached the situation with the strategic coordination of military generals planning a siege, using every psychological weapon in their arsenal to force my compliance. The first phase of their campaign involved recruiting extended family members to join their crusade against my selfish refusal to help Casey during her time of need. Phone calls were made to aunts, uncles, and grandparents, presenting a carefully crafted narrative that portrayed me as the stubborn, unreasonable daughter who was prioritizing her own convenience over her sister's legal crisis and recovery. Alex is being incredibly difficult about this, I overheard my mother telling my grandmother during one of these recruitment calls. Casey needs transportation to meet her court requirements and maintain her job, but Alex won't even consider letting her borrow the car temporarily. We're trying to help Casey get her life back on track, but Alex seems more concerned about her own minor inconvenience than her sister's welfare. The narrative was masterfully constructed to make me appear selfish and unreasonable while completely omitting the context of Casey's repeated accidents, DUI charges, and years of reckless behavior that had led to this crisis. Extended family members who received these carefully edited versions of events began calling me directly to express their disappointment in my lack of family loyalty and compassion. "Alexandra, I'm surprised by your attitude toward your sister's situation," my grandfather said during one particularly painful conversation. "Family members help each other during difficult times, and Casey really needs your support right now. I think you should reconsider your position and do the right thing." The pressure from extended family was emotionally devastating because it was based on incomplete information and manipulated narratives that made me appear cruel and unsupportive. These were people whose opinions I valued and whose approval had been important to me throughout my life, and their disappointment felt like losing crucial allies in an increasingly hostile family environment. The second phase of the pressure campaign involved financial manipulation designed to create economic consequences for my continued resistance. My parents began implementing subtle punishments that affected my daily life and long-term security in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. The first financial punishment came when my father informed me that the family cell phone plan would be restructured to reduce costs, which meant that I would need to establish my own phone service or accept downgraded coverage that would affect my ability to work and maintain social connections. The timing of this cost-cutting measure immediately following my refusal to surrender my car was clearly punitive but presented as routine family budget management. "We're trying to streamline our expenses and encourage everyone to take more responsibility for their own costs," my father explained with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as reasonable policy. "Casey's legal expenses have been substantial, and we need to reduce spending in other areas." The irony of implementing cost-cutting measures that affected me while simultaneously planning to purchase another replacement vehicle for Casey was so blatant that it felt like deliberate psychological warfare. I was being punished financially for refusing to enable my sister's continued irresponsibility, while she continued to receive unlimited financial support for her destructive choices. Additional financial pressures followed in rapid succession. The family health insurance plan would be modified in ways that increased my costs. My childhood bedroom would be converted to a home office unless I paid rent to continue using it, and various household privileges would be restructured as fee-for-service arrangements that effectively charged me for remaining in the family home. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the pressure campaign was the systematic gaslighting designed to make me question the reasonableness of my position and the validity of my concerns about Casey's behavior. My parents began rewriting family history to minimize Casey's previous accidents and characterize her current legal troubles as extraordinary circumstances that justified extraordinary family response. "Alex, you're acting like Casey has a pattern of irresponsible behavior, but these recent problems are really just bad luck and poor timing," my mother said during one of many conversations designed to manipulate my perception of reality. "She's been dealing with a lot of stress lately, and sometimes people make mistakes when they're overwhelmed. The important thing is that we support her through this difficult period." The attempt to characterize 4 car accidents, multiple DUI arrests, and years of reckless driving as bad luck rather than evidence of dangerous behavior was so ridiculous that it would have been laughable under different circumstances. But when delivered by my parents with complete seriousness and supported by their unified narrative, the gaslighting was effective in making me doubt my own perceptions and memories. The psychological manipulation extended to reframing my refusal to surrender my car as evidence of character flaws and moral deficiencies that needed to be corrected through family intervention. Every conversation became an opportunity for my parents to analyze my motivations, question my values, and suggest that my resistance reflected deeper problems with my personality and family relationships. "We're concerned about your lack of empathy for Casey's situation," my father said during what was supposedly a family discussion but felt more like an intervention designed to pathologize my position. "Your unwillingness to make even temporary sacrifices to help your sister suggests some troubling patterns in your thinking that might benefit from professional counseling." The suggestion that I needed therapy for refusing to enable my sister's dangerous behavior while she received unlimited support for criminal conduct was such a complete inversion of reality that it felt like living in an alternate universe where right and wrong had been completely reversed. As the pressure campaign intensified over the course of the week, it became clear that my parents were not interested in compromise, negotiation, or alternative solutions that might address Casey's transportation needs without requiring me to surrender my independence and mobility. The only acceptable outcome was my complete capitulation to their demands, accompanied by grateful acknowledgement that helping Casey was a privilege rather than a sacrifice. The final phase of the pressure campaign involved escalation to direct threats and ultimatums designed to force immediate compliance through fear of consequences that would be even more severe than the financial and emotional punishments I was already experiencing. "Alex, we've been patient with your resistance, but this situation needs to be resolved," my mother said during what would be our final conversation before the abandonment incident. "Casey's court date is next week, and she needs reliable transportation. If you won't voluntarily cooperate with the family's needs, we'll have to consider other options." The vague threat about other options was delivered with the kind of ominous tone that suggested consequences I couldn't imagine, and it created an atmosphere of impending crisis that was clearly designed to make me fearful and compliant. But what my parents hadn't anticipated was that their escalating pressure campaign had actually strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Every manipulation tactic, every financial punishment, every attempt to gaslight me into doubting my own perceptions had reinforced my understanding that this conflict was about much more than temporary car sharing. This was about whether I would allow my family to treat me as a resource to be exploited for Casey's benefit, whether I would accept their characterization of my reasonable boundaries as character flaws, and whether I would continue to enable a family dynamic that rewarded destructive behavior while punishing responsibility and independence. My continued refusal to surrender my car keys represented my first serious attempt to establish adult boundaries with family members who had never respected my autonomy or treated me as an equal participant in family decisions. The intensity of their reaction revealed how invested they were in maintaining a family hierarchy that positioned me as a supporting character in Casey's drama rather than the protagonist of my own life. But I had no idea that their other options would involve a level of cruelty and calculated abandonment that would expose criminal behavior far beyond the financial favoritism and psychological manipulation I had already experienced. The plan to abandon me in the wilderness 3 miles from any cell signal was orchestrated with the kind of detailed coordination that suggested my parents and Casey had been discussing this solution 4 days before executing it. What I initially believed was a spontaneous family crisis would later be revealed as a premeditated act of calculated cruelty designed to force my compliance through fear, isolation, and genuine threats to my safety. The setup began on a Thursday morning when my mother called me at work with what appeared to be an urgent family emergency requiring my immediate assistance. Casey had supposedly experienced a medical crisis related to stress from her legal situation and had been taken to a hospital nearly an hour outside our city for specialized treatment that wasn't available at local facilities. "Alex, you need to come home right away," my mother said, her voice carrying the kind of panic that made questioning the situation seem callous and inappropriate. "Casey collapsed this morning and the paramedics said she needs to be transported to Mountain View Medical Center. We need to follow the ambulance, but your father's car is in the shop and mine won't make the trip reliably." The request seemed reasonable under the circumstances she described, and despite our ongoing conflict about the car situation, I wasn't going to refuse transportation during what appeared to be a genuine medical emergency involving my sister's health and safety. I left work immediately and drove home to find my parents waiting in the driveway with overnight bags and the kind of anxious energy that suggested they had been preparing for a long hospital vigil. Casey was nowhere to be seen, which my mother explained by saying she had already been transported by ambulance to the medical facility where we would meet her. "Thank you for coming, Alex," my father said as he loaded their bags into my car. "I know we've had our differences about the transportation situation, but family emergencies require us to put aside our disagreements and work together." The gratitude and acknowledgement of our conflict seemed genuine, and I allowed myself to hope that this crisis might provide an opportunity for our family to reset our relationship and address the underlying issues that had been causing so much tension and hostility. The drive to Mountain View Medical Center took nearly 2 hours through increasingly remote countryside that gradually transitioned from suburban development to rural farmland and finally to the kind of mountainous wilderness where cell phone coverage became spotty and gas stations were separated by dozens of miles. Throughout the drive, my parents maintained the medical emergency narrative with consistent details about Casey's condition, the specialized treatment she was receiving, and the importance of family support during her recovery process. They expressed appropriate concern for her well-being while also acknowledging that this crisis might be the wake-up call she needed to address her substance abuse issues and reckless behavior patterns. Sometimes it takes a serious health scare to make people realize they need to change their priorities and make better choices, my mother reflected during the drive. Maybe this will be the turning point that helps Casey get her life back on track. The conversation felt more honest and productive than our family interactions had been in months, and I began to feel optimistic that this crisis might ultimately strengthen our relationships and lead to healthier family dynamics based on mutual support rather than manipulation and favoritism. But as we approached the medical facility, the first signs of deception began to emerge in subtle inconsistencies that initially seemed like confusion but would later be revealed as evidence of a coordinated lie designed to manipulate me into a vulnerable position. When we arrived at Mountain View Medical Center, my parents directed me to park in a remote section of the facility's lot that was nearly empty and seemed unusually far from the main hospital entrance. When I questioned the parking choice, my father explained that the closer spaces were reserved for emergency vehicles and that we needed to respect the hospital's traffic flow protocols. "The main entrance gets congested during shift changes," he said, gesturing toward the distant building. "It's better to park here and walk a bit rather than create additional stress for the medical staff who are dealing with Casey's situation." As we approached the hospital entrance, my mother suddenly stopped and announced that she had forgotten Casey's insurance cards and important medical documents in my car. She asked me to return to retrieve the paperwork while she and my father went inside to check on Casey's status and speak with her medical team. "Can you grab the folder from under the front seat?" she asked, handing me the car keys. "It has all of Casey's medical history and insurance information that the doctors will need. We'll meet you inside once you've found everything." The request seemed reasonable, and I took the keys and walked back toward my car while my parents entered the hospital building. But when I reached my vehicle and began searching for the supposed medical documents, I found nothing under either front seat except routine car maintenance paperwork and outdated insurance cards that had nothing to do with Casey's current medical situation. After several minutes of searching through every compartment and storage area in my car, I returned to the hospital entrance to inform my parents that I couldn't find the documents they had requested. But when I approached the information desk and asked about the Morrison family, the receptionist's response immediately revealed that something was seriously wrong with the situation. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any patients named Casey Morrison currently in our facility," the receptionist said after checking her computer system. "Are you sure you have the right hospital? There are several medical facilities in this area." The confusion and concern in the receptionist's voice was genuine, and her inability to locate any record of Casey's admission or treatment made it clear that the medical emergency that had brought me to this remote location was completely fabricated. I searched the hospital building for over an hour, checking with multiple departments and security personnel, but found no evidence that my parents had ever been inside the facility or that Casey had ever been admitted for treatment. The medical emergency, the specialized care, the family crisis that had required my immediate assistance, all of it had been an elaborate deception designed to manipulate me into traveling to this remote location. But the full scope of their betrayal didn't become clear until I returned to the parking lot and discovered that my car was gone. The vehicle I had driven to this remote hospital was no longer in the space where I had parked it, and the key fob in my pocket was no longer connected to any nearby vehicle. The realization that my parents had orchestrated this entire scenario to steal my car while abandoning me at a remote medical facility was so shocking and cruel that it took several minutes for me to process the full implications of what had happened. They had used a fake medical emergency to manipulate me into a vulnerable position, then stolen my vehicle and left me stranded in a location that was specifically chosen for its isolation and lack of communication infrastructure. As I stood in the empty parking lot trying to comprehend the magnitude of their betrayal, I realized that this wasn't just about forcing me to surrender my car to Casey. This was about punishing me for refusing to comply with their demands and demonstrating the consequences of challenging their authority over family resources and decisions. The abandonment was calculated psychological warfare designed to break my resistance through fear, isolation, and the demonstration that my parents were willing to put my safety at risk to maintain their control over family dynamics and resource allocation. But what they hadn't anticipated was that their act of calculated cruelty would motivate me to investigate our family's financial situation more thoroughly than I had ever done before, leading to discoveries that would expose criminal behavior far more serious than car theft and abandonment. Standing alone in that hospital parking lot at 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountainous horizon while trying to process the reality that my own parents had orchestrated my abandonment in the middle of nowhere, I experienced a clarity of thought that comes only in moments of genuine crisis. The shock of their betrayal was overwhelming, but beneath the emotional devastation was a growing determination to not just survive this situation but to understand why they had been willing to go to such extreme lengths to steal my car. The immediate survival challenges were daunting and potentially life-threatening. Mountain View Medical Center was located in a rural area with limited public transportation, no ride-sharing services, and cell phone coverage so spotty that my attempts to call for help kept failing due to insufficient signal strength. The nearest town with reliable services was over 15 miles away, accessible only by a winding mountain road that would be dangerous to walk, especially as darkness approached. The hospital staff, while sympathetic to my situation, had strict policies about liability and couldn't provide transportation to stranded visitors. The security guard who tried to help me contact local taxi services discovered that the few companies serving the area had no available drivers and wouldn't commit to the lengthy rural pickup even if one became available. "Ma'am, I've seen family disputes before, but abandoning someone out here without transportation crosses a line," the security guard, Tom Martinez, told me with genuine concern. "This area gets dangerous after dark, especially for someone on foot. You need to find shelter for the night and figure out transportation in the morning." You know what's incredible about rock bottom moments? They have this way of stripping away all the illusions you've been carrying about the people in your life, forcing you to see them exactly as they are rather than who you hoped they might be. As I'm standing in this parking lot, abandoned by the people who claim to love me, I'm realizing that this isn't just about a car. This is about a family that views me as completely expendable when I don't serve their purposes. What do you think my next move should be? And if you're feeling the same energy of someone who's about to channel survival mode into something powerful, hit that subscribe button because what I discovered during my night of abandonment is going to change everything. Tom's wife Maria, who worked in the hospital's patient advocacy department, offered to let me spend the night on the break room couch rather than risk the dangerous walk toward town in darkness. Their kindness from complete strangers provided a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty of my own family members, and it gave me the safety and time I needed to begin processing the full implications of what had happened. During that long night in the hospital break room, unable to sleep due to adrenaline and emotional shock, I began making phone calls and sending emails from the hospital's Wi-Fi to piece together the truth about our family's financial situation and the real reasons my parents had been so desperate to gain control of my vehicle. The first breakthrough came when I contacted our auto insurance company to report my car as stolen. The customer service representative I spoke with revealed information that immediately raised red flags about my family's insurance history and recent claims activity. Ms. Morrison, I show that there have been multiple claims filed on vehicles associated with your family address over the past 2 years, the representative explained. The claim patterns are unusual, and there's actually a flag on your account requesting additional documentation for any new claims due to the frequency and nature of previous incidents. Multiple claims. Unusual patterns. Account flags. The language suggested that insurance investigators had already identified suspicious activity related to our family's vehicle history, and my parents' desperate need for my car was beginning to make sense in a much darker context. The insurance representative couldn't provide specific details about other family members' claims without proper authorization, but she could confirm that my own vehicle was currently listed as the primary insured car on our family policy and that its clean driving record and lack of claims history made it valuable for maintaining reasonable insurance rates. The second revelation came through online research I conducted using the hospital's computer system. I accessed public records databases and discovered that Casey's driving record was even worse than I had known, with multiple DUI convictions, reckless driving charges, and license suspensions that made her virtually uninsurable through standard providers. But more troubling was the discovery that several vehicles associated with our family address had been reported as total losses due to accidents or theft over the past 18 months, far more incidents than the ones I was aware of from Casey's known accidents. The pattern suggested that my family had been involved in systematic insurance fraud, using multiple vehicles and claims to generate payouts that exceeded legitimate accident losses. My car, with its clean record and clear title, represented valuable insurance coverage that could be used to continue their fraudulent scheme. The third discovery came when I gained access to our family's financial accounts through online banking systems where I was listed as an authorized user for emergency purposes. What I found in those accounts was evidence of financial activity that confirmed my growing suspicions about the true nature of their desperation to control my vehicle. Large insurance payouts had been deposited regularly over the past 2 years, corresponding with dates that matched the vehicle incidents I had discovered in public records. But instead of using these payouts to purchase replacement vehicles or cover legitimate expenses, the money had been systematically diverted to other accounts and purposes that seemed designed to hide the source of the funds. More disturbing was the discovery of loan documents and credit applications that used my car as collateral for borrowing I had never authorized. My parents had been using my vehicle's clean title and insurance coverage as security for loans and financial arrangements that put my credit and legal standing at risk without my knowledge or consent. The pattern revealed that the pressure campaign to get me to surrender my car wasn't just about Casey's transportation needs, it was about maintaining access to an asset that had become crucial to their ongoing financial fraud schemes. My refusal to hand over the keys had threatened to expose criminal activity that extended far beyond insurance fraud into identity theft, loan fraud, and systematic financial deception. As dawn broke over the mountains surrounding the hospital where I had spent the night documenting my family's crimes, I realized that their abandonment of me represented something far more serious than family favoritism or even psychological abuse. They had put my physical safety at risk to protect ongoing criminal enterprises that could result in federal charges and prison sentences. The evidence I had gathered during my night of investigation would later prove crucial for law enforcement agencies investigating insurance fraud, financial crimes, and the network of illegal activities that my family had been operating for years. But in that moment, my primary concern was getting home safely and ensuring that I could never again be manipulated or endangered by people who viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Tom and Maria Martinez drove me to the nearest bus station the next morning, refusing any payment for their kindness and expressing genuine concern about the family situation that had led to my abandonment. Their generosity from complete strangers provided a powerful reminder that real family relationships are based on care and protection rather than manipulation and exploitation. "Ms. Morrison, what your family did to you was criminal abandonment," Tom said as they dropped me off. "People who love you don't put your safety at risk to get what they want. I hope you'll consider pressing charges." The bus ride home took 6 hours and gave me plenty of time to plan my next steps, which would involve not just recovering my stolen vehicle but exposing the full scope of my family's criminal behavior to appropriate law enforcement agencies. The daughter they had abandoned in the wilderness was returning with evidence that would destroy everything they had built through years of fraud and deception. The documentation I had gathered during my night at Mountain View Medical Center represented just the beginning of what would become a comprehensive investigation into my family's criminal activities. Over the following 3 days, while staying at a friend's apartment to avoid confrontation until I was fully prepared, I systematically uncovered evidence of insurance fraud, identity theft, and financial crimes that spanned years and involved multiple government agencies and private companies. The insurance fraud investigation revealed the most extensive pattern of criminal behavior. Working with investigators from the State Insurance Commission, I provided documentation showing that my family had filed over 15 fraudulent claims in the past 3 years, using a network of vehicles, staged accidents, and false statements to generate payouts exceeding $300,000. Casey's multiple accidents hadn't been the result of poor judgment and substance abuse. They had been part of a coordinated scheme to file insurance claims for vehicles that were then either sold privately or used as collateral for additional loans. The pattern was sophisticated enough to avoid immediate detection but consistent enough to establish clear evidence of intent to defraud. "Ms. Morrison, what your family has been doing constitutes organized insurance fraud at a level that typically involves federal prosecution," explained Detective Sarah Kim from the Financial Crimes Division. "The systematic nature of the false claims, combined with identity theft and loan fraud, puts this case into federal jurisdiction with potential sentences of 10 to 20 years for each participant." The identity theft component was particularly disturbing because it revealed how extensively my parents had been using my personal information and credit history to support their criminal enterprises. My social security number, driver's license information, and financial accounts had been used to secure loans, establish insurance policies, and create financial obligations that I was legally responsible for despite having no knowledge of their existence. The loan fraud extended beyond my car title to include credit cards, personal loans, and business financing that had been obtained using my identity and credit score. The total amount of fraudulent debt associated with my name exceeded $180,000. Creating a financial disaster that would have destroyed my credit and potentially resulted in criminal charges against me if the scheme had continued. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was that Casey had been a willing and active participant in the fraud scheme rather than simply a beneficiary of my parents' criminal behavior. Bank records and communication evidence showed that she had been coordinating with my parents to stage accidents, file false claims, and launder money through accounts they controlled jointly. The fake medical emergency that had been used to lure me to the remote hospital was just the latest in a series of elaborate deceptions they had been using to manipulate family members and outside parties for financial gain. They had become skilled at creating convincing narratives that justified their actions while hiding the criminal intent behind their behavior. Armed with comprehensive evidence and support from multiple law enforcement agencies, I finally felt prepared to confront my family about their crimes and demand the return of my stolen vehicle. But I had no intention of handling this confrontation alone or in private where they could attempt to manipulate the situation or make threats against my safety. The confrontation took place at our family home on a Sunday afternoon, with Detective Kim and 2 other investigators present to serve arrest warrants and ensure my safety during what was expected to be a volatile encounter. I had also arranged for my attorney to be present to document any admissions or threats that might be made during the arrests. My parents' shock at seeing me arrive with law enforcement was genuine and revealed that they had expected their abandonment strategy to be effective in breaking my resistance and forcing my compliance with their demands. They had clearly believed that the trauma and fear of being stranded in a remote location would make me grateful to be rescued and willing to accept whatever terms they offered for my return to the family. "Alex, thank God you're safe," my mother said immediately upon seeing me, her relief apparently genuine despite the calculated cruelty of orchestrating my abandonment. "We were so worried when you didn't come home." "Casey's been beside herself with concern about what happened to you." The performance was masterful and would have been convincing if I hadn't spent the past 3 days documenting their criminal behavior and understanding the true motives behind their actions. But their concern for my safety was undermined somewhat by the fact that my car was parked in our driveway, confirming that they knew exactly where I had been and how I had gotten home. "Where is Casey?" Detective Kim asked, consulting the arrest warrants that had been prepared based on my evidence and the Insurance Commission's investigation. "She's at work," my father replied, his tone shifting from relieved to cautious as he began to understand that this wasn't a family reconciliation visit. "Why are you asking about Casey? What's this about?" The question was answered when Detective Kim read the charges that had been filed against all 3 family members. Multiple counts of insurance fraud, identity theft, loan fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and in my parents' case, additional charges related to my abandonment that included kidnapping, theft, and endangerment. The reading of charges took over 10 minutes due to the extensive nature of their criminal activities, and I watched my parents' expressions shift from confusion to horror as they began to understand the scope of evidence that had been assembled against them. "This is ridiculous," my mother said when the detective finished. "Alex, you can't seriously be pressing charges against your own family over a misunderstanding about car sharing. This is cruel and vindictive." The characterization of systematic insurance fraud and criminal abandonment as a misunderstanding about car sharing was so absurd that it would have been laughable if the situation hadn't been so serious. But it also revealed their ongoing inability to acknowledge the severity of their crimes or take responsibility for the choices that had led to criminal prosecution. "Mrs. Morrison, this isn't about car sharing," Detective Kim replied firmly. "This is about multiple felony charges including fraud, identity theft, and criminal abandonment. Your daughter has provided extensive evidence of systematic criminal activity that puts all 3 family members at risk of federal prosecution." My father's response was more calculated and revealed his understanding that their situation was genuinely serious. "We want to speak with our attorney before answering any questions or discussing these allegations. Alex, we can work this out as a family without involving law enforcement in private matters." But the attempt to frame federal crimes as private matters that should be handled through family negotiation rather than criminal prosecution showed that even when confronted with arrest warrants, my parents were still trying to minimize the seriousness of their behavior and manipulate me into protecting them from consequences. The search of our family home revealed additional evidence that strengthened the criminal case against them. Financial documents, insurance paperwork, and communication records confirmed the systematic nature of their fraud scheme and showed that it had been operating for much longer than initially suspected. But perhaps the most damaging discovery was a notebook in my mother's handwriting that detailed their plans for expanding the fraud scheme using my vehicle and credit history. The notes included specific strategies for staging accidents, filing claims, and using the insurance payouts to fund additional criminal activities. Phase 3. Get Alex's car under family control, read one entry. Clean record equals higher payouts plus easier loan collateral. If she resists, create crisis requiring family cooperation. The written evidence of premeditation made it clear that my abandonment hadn't been a spontaneous act of anger or desperation. It had been a calculated step in a long-term criminal strategy that viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited for financial gain. Casey's arrest at her workplace later that afternoon completed the dismantling of their criminal enterprise. Unlike my parents, who had maintained their innocence and demanded attorney representation, Casey immediately began cooperating with investigators and providing detailed information about the fraud scheme in exchange for potential plea arrangements. "Alex, I never wanted it to go this far," she said during the brief conversation we had at the police station. "Mom and Dad said it was temporary, just until they could get their finances straightened out. I didn't realize how serious this had become." Her explanation revealed the family dynamics that had enabled years of criminal behavior. My parents had positioned themselves as the masterminds while presenting Casey and me as either willing participants or obstacles to be overcome, depending on our usefulness to their schemes. The federal investigation that followed my family's arrest uncovered connections to other fraud networks and revealed that their criminal activities had been more extensive and sophisticated than initially suspected. The case ultimately involved multiple agencies and resulted in charges that carried potential sentences exceeding 20 years for each participant. But beyond the legal consequences, the most important outcome of the confrontation was the complete validation of my decision to refuse their demands and resist their manipulation tactics. The family members who had characterized my boundaries as selfishness and my concerns as paranoia had been exposed as criminals whose desperation to control my vehicle was motivated by federal crimes that put my freedom and safety at risk. The daughter they had abandoned in the wilderness had returned with evidence that destroyed their criminal enterprise and exposed the true nature of the family dynamics that had shaped my entire life. Their systematic favoritism toward Casey hadn't been about her superior character or their greater love for her, it had been about her willingness to participate in criminal activities that I had unknowingly refused to enable. The federal prosecution of the Morrison family insurance fraud case became a landmark example of how systematic financial crimes can destroy families and communities when greed overcomes basic moral boundaries. The evidence I had gathered during my night of abandonment, combined with the extensive investigation conducted by multiple agencies, revealed criminal activities that spanned 3 states and involved losses exceeding $500,000 to insurance companies, banks, and individual victims. The plea negotiations revealed the full scope of each family member's involvement and culpability in the criminal enterprise. My parents, as the organizers and primary beneficiaries of the fraud scheme, faced the most serious charges and potential sentences. Casey's cooperation with investigators earned her a reduced sentence but also required her to provide testimony that detailed the systematic nature of their criminal activities. The defendants operated a sophisticated fraud network that used family relationships to avoid detection and maximize illegal profits, explained federal prosecutor Maria Santos during the sentencing hearing. They exploited insurance systems, banking regulations, and family trust to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars while putting innocent family members at legal and physical risk. My father received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison plus restitution exceeding $400,000. The judge specifically noted that his role as the primary organizer of the fraud scheme, combined with his abandonment of me in a remote location, demonstrated a level of moral bankruptcy that warranted the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. My mother was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison plus restitution, with the judge commenting on her active participation in identity theft and her willingness to endanger her daughter's safety to protect criminal enterprises. Her tearful apology during sentencing was undermined by evidence showing she had continued attempting to manipulate family members and witnesses even after her arrest. Casey's sentence of 4 years in federal prison reflected her cooperation with investigators but also acknowledged her willing participation in criminal activities that had victimized insurance companies and endangered family members. Her testimony revealed that she had been aware of the fraud scheme for over 2 years and had actively helped stage accidents and file false claims. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the legal proceedings was the complete financial destruction of everything my family had built through years of criminal activity. The asset forfeiture process resulted in the seizure of vehicles, real estate, and financial accounts that had been purchased with proceeds from fraud. The family home, the replacement cars, and every luxury item that had represented their success were sold to pay restitution to victims. The social consequences were equally devastating for people who had built their identity around respectability and community standing. The media coverage of their arrest and conviction destroyed their reputation in the community where they had lived for decades, and former friends and business associates quickly distanced themselves from association with convicted fraudsters. It's shocking to discover that people you thought you knew were capable of such systematic deception, commented one neighbor to local reporters. The way they treated their own daughter reveals a level of moral corruption that's hard to comprehend. The investigation also revealed that I had been unknowingly victimized by their criminal activities in ways that extended far beyond the identity theft and loan fraud I had initially discovered. My credit report showed multiple accounts and obligations that had been created without my knowledge, and my personal information had been used to establish business relationships and financial arrangements that put me at legal risk. The process of repairing the damage to my credit history and financial standing took over 18 months and required extensive documentation to prove that I had been a victim rather than a participant in the fraud scheme. The experience provided a painful education in how family financial abuse can create consequences that extend for years after the immediate crimes are exposed and prosecuted. But the most meaningful aspect of the legal resolution was the official validation that my refusal to surrender my car keys had been reasonable and necessary rather than selfish and unreasonable as my family had characterized it. The court proceedings established that their pressure campaign, abandonment, and theft had been criminal acts designed to force my participation in federal crimes. Ms. Morrison's resistance to her family's demands prevented her from becoming an unwilling participant in criminal activities that would have resulted in her own prosecution, Judge Patricia Martinez noted during the sentencing hearing. Her courage in exposing these crimes protected not only herself but other potential victims of this criminal enterprise. The civil lawsuit I filed against my family for identity theft, endangerment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress resulted in additional monetary damages that provided some compensation for the years of psychological abuse and the trauma of being abandoned in a remote location. But more importantly, it established legal precedent for holding family members accountable for financial crimes that victimize relatives. The most unexpected outcome of the entire ordeal was the complete absence of any desire for family reconciliation or relationship repair. The woman who had once desperately sought family approval and belonging discovered that life without their manipulation and exploitation was so much better that contact with them would represent regression rather than healing. Alex, one of the most important indicators of your recovery is how little emotional investment you have in your family of origin's opinions or approval, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the trauma specialist I worked with during the legal proceedings. You've moved from seeking their validation to recognizing that their judgment was always compromised by criminal intent. The relationships I built with the law enforcement officers, attorneys, and victim advocates who helped me through the legal process provided examples of what healthy professional and personal relationships could look like when based on mutual respect rather than exploitation and manipulation. Detective Sarah Kim, who had led the investigation, became a professional mentor who encouraged me to consider a career in financial crimes prevention. Your ability to recognize patterns and document evidence was crucial to this prosecution, she told me. You have natural instincts for investigation that could help other families avoid similar victimization. The experience of surviving family abandonment and exposing criminal behavior had transformed me from a victim seeking approval into an advocate capable of protecting myself and others from similar exploitation. The skills I had developed during my night of crisis research and documentation had practical applications that could serve other victims of family financial abuse. As the legal proceedings concluded and my family began serving their prison sentences, I reflected on the irony that their cruel abandonment had ultimately provided me with the motivation and evidence needed to destroy their criminal enterprise and build an independent life free from their manipulation. The daughter they had abandoned in the wilderness to break her spirit had instead discovered her strength and used it to ensure they would never again be in a position to exploit or endanger anyone. 2 years after being abandoned in that hospital parking lot 3 miles from cell phone signal, I'm sitting in my office at the Financial Crimes Prevention Center, writing this story while looking at the commendation letter from the FBI recognizing my role in exposing a fraud network that ultimately led to dozens of arrests across multiple states. The woman who was once viewed as the stubborn daughter refusing to share her car now works as a federal consultant helping other families recognize and escape financial exploitation schemes. The transformation from victim to advocate began during the legal proceedings when I realized that my experience surviving family criminal behavior had given me unique insights into how financial abuse operates within trusted relationships. The skills I had developed during my crisis night of research and documentation were exactly the abilities needed to help other victims gather evidence and protect themselves from family members who view them as resources to be exploited rather than people to be loved. My career with the Financial Crimes Prevention Center focuses specifically on family-based fraud schemes, helping law enforcement agencies understand the psychological dynamics that make relatives particularly effective at victimizing each other. The trust and emotional manipulation that characterize family relationships create opportunities for exploitation that would be impossible between strangers. Alex's work has revolutionized how we investigate and prosecute family financial crimes, says director Michael Torres. She understands both the criminal methodologies and the psychological impact of family betrayal in ways that help us build stronger cases and provide better support for victims. The speaking engagements that initially terrified me have become opportunities to help audiences recognize warning signs of family financial abuse before it escalates to criminal behavior. My story resonates with people because it demonstrates how even loving families can become environments for exploitation when boundaries are ignored and financial transparency is absent. The most important lesson I share is that family love shouldn't require you to accept exploitation or endangerment, I tell audiences. When relatives pressure you to surrender control of your assets, question your own perceptions, or participate in activities that feel wrong, those are warning signs that the relationship has become abusive rather than supportive. The financial recovery from my family's crimes took over a year to complete but ultimately provided resources that allowed me to build an independent life based on my own values rather than survival necessities. The restitution payments, combined with the civil lawsuit settlement, created financial security that enabled me to pursue meaningful work rather than just economic stability. But more importantly, the psychological recovery from years of family manipulation and the trauma of abandonment has been transformational in ways that extend far beyond career success or financial independence. The woman who once doubted her own perceptions and apologized for having boundaries has learned to trust her instincts and advocate for herself effectively. The most significant change in Alex has been her ability to recognize healthy relationships and set appropriate boundaries, observes Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who continues to provide occasional consultation as I navigate the ongoing process of building chosen family relationships. She's learned to distinguish between people who support her growth and people who want to control her choices. The romantic relationship I've developed with David Chen, a financial crimes attorney who specializes in victim advocacy, represents the first partnership of my adult life that's based on equality and mutual respect rather than power imbalances or emotional manipulation. Meeting someone who understands exploitation professionally while supporting my advocacy work personally has been incredibly healing. What I admire most about you is how you've transformed trauma into purpose, David told me recently. You could have just rebuilt your own life and moved on, but instead you're using your experience to prevent other families from destroying themselves through criminal behavior. The complete absence of contact with my biological family has been one of the most positive aspects of my recovery process. My parents remain in federal prison with several years left on their sentences, while Casey was released after serving 3 years but made no attempt to contact me. The peace of living without their manipulation, crisis, and exploitation has been more liberating than I could have imagined. The chosen family I've built includes colleagues, friends, and mentors who value authenticity and growth rather than compliance and service. These relationships provide the support and celebration that healthy families should offer, without the conditions and expectations that characterized my biological family dynamics. The most meaningful recognition of my transformation came last month when I was invited to testify before Congress about the need for stronger protections against family financial abuse. Speaking to lawmakers about how my abandonment had exposed criminal behavior that victimized multiple families felt like the ultimate validation of my decision to resist my parents' demands and expose their crimes. Ms. Morrison's case demonstrates why family financial transparency isn't just good practice. It's essential protection against exploitation, I told the congressional committee. When family members can operate in secrecy, that secrecy often exists to hide criminal behavior that hurts everyone involved. The legislation that resulted from our advocacy work will require disclosure and oversight for family financial arrangements involving loans, insurance, and asset transfers. These protections could prevent other families from experiencing the kind of systematic exploitation that my parents had been able to conduct without detection for years. As I finish writing this story, I'm preparing for another speaking engagement where I'll share the message that has become central to my advocacy work. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their harmful behavior, even when that refusal results in conflict and consequences you never imagined. So here's my question for everyone who has followed this journey from family victim to federal consultant. Have you ever had to choose between your own safety and family expectations? When people who claim to love you ask you to do things that feel wrong or dangerous, that's usually your intuition trying to protect you from people whose love comes with conditions that could destroy your life. If this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice has resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about recognizing manipulation and building authentic independence. Share this with anyone who has ever been pressured by family to make choices that seemed unfair or dangerous. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we most need protection from. Tell me in the comments about a time when you had to stand up to family pressure or trust your instincts over other people's expectations. Your stories of courage and boundary setting might inspire someone else to question family dynamics they've been told to accept or investigate financial arrangements that don't feel transparent. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey from abandoned daughter to federal advocate, from victim of family crimes to someone who helps other families avoid similar destruction. Remember, healthy families don't ask you to sacrifice your safety for their convenience, don't pressure you to ignore your instincts, and don't punish you for having reasonable boundaries about your own property and well-being. Here's to families built on respect rather than exploitation, to relationships that celebrate your strength rather than punishing your independence, and to the incredible power that comes from refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth or endangers your future. The daughter they abandoned 3 miles from any signal became someone whose voice now reaches millions of people and whose work protects families across the country. Life has taught me that the people who try to convince you that standing up for yourself is selfish are usually the people who benefit from your compliance. The question isn't whether you have the right to protect yourself from family exploitation, it's whether you have the courage to walk away from people who view your love as weakness they can exploit for their own benefit.